faith. How are they related? And where do they intersect? How are they related and where do they intersect? That's the question that's brought to us through our story in Mark today, from our text. And Mark's telling of this story compared to the other Gospels is very brief, and that's what we've come to expect from Mark, is these brief accounts. But in these short 7-8 verses, he packs in a lot of very specific detail. It starts out on that day. So what day are we talking about? We're talking about the day that he was giving all his parables on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Great crowds had come around, so many people in fact, that for his safety he got into a boat and he preached from the boat to the people on the shore. And then it says, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with him in the boat just as he was. Other boats were with him. So it's evening now. He's taught all day long. And it says, leaving the crowd behind. This is his one exit. There's so many people on the shore that he had to preach from a boat. And so now to get away from the crowd, to get some respite, he says, let us go across and leave now, and leave the crowd behind. And then it says, they left just as he was. So there was no preparation for this trip across the sea. It's not like he had a gunny sack pre-packed and it was pre-planned that he would travel to the other side. And then it says other boats were with him. I'm not sure whether the boats that him and the disciples were in were so small that they needed a few of them, or whether there was others that were in boats while he was preaching that followed along, but there's certainly more than one boat going across. And then our story picks up and it says, a great gale arose and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion, and they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing?" That's the first question of 4 in these few verses. There's 2 by the disciples and 2 by Jesus. This is the first one by the disciples, then we'll have 2 from Jesus, and then bookend by a last question by the disciples. They ask, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" It's interesting they don't ask, "Teacher, help us. Teacher, save us from our certain death." They ask, "Do you even care what's happening to us?" And that's an important distinction of the question and how they ask it, because they are scared and they're frightened by this storm. Keep in mind that most of them came from fishing families. I'm certain they've probably experienced storms on the sea before. So they're probably not exaggerating that this particular storm is of significance. They feel they're going to die. And they don't ask Jesus for help. They ask him, "Do you care? Do you care that we're perishing?" They have witnessed Jesus do many miracles up to this point. They've seen people healed. They've seen demons, possessed people be cleansed. They've heard his teachings about what the kingdom is like. They know he cares about people. What they want to know is, does he care about them? Does he care about them? And that seems to be clear in how they ask this question. That they, at this point, have more fear than they have faith. They have more fear than they have faith. Because if they had a lot of faith, that question would have been posed differently. They would have asked, "Jesus, help us," because they would have had faith that he could. They're asking, "Do you care?" do you care? The question, do you care, comes from a place of despair and fear and not a place of faith. So fear and faith, how are they related and where do they intersect? Our story goes on to say, he woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Be silent, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" There are several psalms that the disciples would have been familiar with that speak about God calming the sea. In Psalm 65, verse 7, it says, "You silence the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves in the tumult of the peoples." In Psalm 89, verse 9, "You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them." And in our song today, Psalm 107, verse 29, we read, "He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed." Those psalms talk about what God was doing for the sea, for the raging of the sea and the storms, and now Jesus is doing just that, calming the sea and the waves. And the disciples were filled with a great awe at that, and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" They're asking each other, is this really the Son of God? We know God does this. We read it in the Psalms, but now he's doing it. Is he truly the Son of God? And I think they're probably filled with more questions than answers at this point. Have you ever felt that way? Being filled with more questions than answers? I know when that happens to me, when the questions outnumber the answers, there's a sense of anxiety that starts building in me. People are nodding their heads, so I think you agree with me. Anxiety starts building up, and then fear starts creeping in, and then those questions creep in. Where are you, God, in this? God, do you care about what's happening to me? That's what's going on with our disciples in the boat. They have more questions than answers. Their anxiety level is going up. Their fear is creeping in or flooding in. And they're asking the question, where are you, God? Do you care about us? And Jesus wakes up and he says, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And so that question is posed to us. Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? But when we're overwhelmed with more questions than answers, we are filled with fear. We're filled with anxiety. So fear and faith, how are they related and where do they intersect? Here's my thought on that question. It seems that responding in fear and responding in faith seem to be two different things, don't they? But they're responding to the same situation. So maybe it's not whether we are afraid, but how we respond to that. Faith doesn't so much banish fear as it does make it possible to cope with it. Faith doesn't banish our fear, but it makes it possible to cope with it. So what moves us from fear to faith? It's Jesus Christ and our relationship with him. So maybe the more appropriate question would be not what moves us from fear to faith, but who. Who moves us from faith to fear? And that's through God, through the actions and the deeds and the work words of Jesus Christ. It's with him that we're able to cope with our fear, that our faith rises up in us with a relationship with God, and that is a gift from God for us. It's key to note that in this story, Jesus doesn't wake up and ask the disciples what they need. He already knows. He knows what's causing their fear, and he quells it immediately. And Jesus can do the same thing for us. And that's good news for us, because when we have more fear than faith, we can still ask Jesus. Jesus doesn't wait till the disciples come to this maturity of faith before he acts. He wakes up, he knows what they need, and he responds immediately. And I say that is the good news for us, that we don't have to come to some level of mature faith before we seek what God has for us. We can come to him in our fear, and he provides and helps us have the faith through Jesus Christ so that we can move away from our fear with faith so that we can cope with it. In this text, the word great is used 3 times. Great storm, great calm, great awe. The number 3 is always significant in our Bible. It follows our Holy Trinity. And so we move through 3 things. The great storm, the great calm comes, and then the great awe. Mark chooses his words very wisely for us. In times in life when those fears, the questions have outnumbered the answers, the fear has flooded in those questions of God, where are you? Do you care? There's one psalm that I've always turned to that speaks to this amazing phase of great storm, great calm, great awe. And that's Psalm 46. Hear the words of Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength and very present help in trouble. Therefore we do not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble with its tumult. We will not fear, even though all those things are happening. And it goes on to say, there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of the city. He's in the midst with us. It shall not be moved. God will help it when the morning dawns. The nations are in uproar. The kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, and the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. And the verse we've probably all heard often, be still and know that I am God. I'm exalted among the nations. I'm exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. There's a great storm. There's a great calm. And there's a great awe. God provides us an internal calm for us that fosters faith in us so that we can cope with our fear. And that's the message that's wrapped up in these 7 verses for us. For that we say thanks be to God.